Good afternoon, maybe morning for you, all right, doctor?
Yeah, it's mid-morning.
Mid-morning. I have the honor and pleasure of talking to Dr. James Richardson. I discovered him through someone on LinkedIn recommended it's a must-read for a startup CPG person, which would include myself. And that's, I guess, usually where I get my book recommendations are from strangers who I feel have no agendas. So you fell into that category, and I bought it on Amazon. The guy's like, you have to buy maybe one. Yeah, I think maybe one. It could have. Yeah, I think he only recommended one book, so it sounded very, authentic. And no regrets. I'm on my second time reading.
Wow,
You know,
thank you.
so if I could sum it up, it's if you go to startup CPG school, you could save yourself a lot of time and just read this book, if I may say. That's the way I would describe the book. Do you disagree?
Well, how could I disagree with that statement? Yeah, thank you.
So it's funny with my LinkedIn, of my best posts in terms of interaction, views, excitement, is people wanted to know, I guess, the core thing is what does it cost to start in CPG? And the second question is, when do you stop spending and close up shop? So if I could throw a number or maybe even a personality option, would you say, I mean, you dealt with, interacted, consulted successfully so many brands and spoke about it. Would you say, let's start with personality type, because that's not a number, that's something you can't buy. Would you say there's a certain personality type that fares better than others in this space?
No, but I'm nitpicking with you. So I'm not a big believer in personality typing. I'm not saying they're false, although there's a lot of controversy. What I'm actually trying to say is that, there are introverts, and extroverts who do just fine. So, that's the most scientifically valid personality continuum that exists, and it has no correlation to success. So let's throw that out right now. What I've talked about before is this concept of resilience, and that has nothing to do with introversion or extroversion. I've taken many of those tests. I actually was put through a professional leadership scoring thing when I was an executive at a consulting company. And I scored 0 out of 100 on introversion. I'm like the most introverted kind of person you'll ever find on earth. So I don't consider myself a failure as an entrepreneur. So, the thing is, I'm resilient. So, I almost got killed 3 times living in India. So writing this book and starting this company, I could hardly call that a big challenge. Although it was, but, getting through the crap of building my own business, I had that confidence. Right?
So
I had a confidence that I could, rebound from trauma, right? That has nothing to do with personality, Moshe. And I think that's the one thing I've noticed, that if you don't have that, I could write you $1 million check and you'll still screw it up. That's my take.
got you. And okay, I'm with you there. What about funding? I mean, just let me talk about myself. I had this drink idea about 18 months ago. I grew up mixing grape juice and seltzer as a kid, you know. I said, let me just put it into a can and sell it. So I went in with total ignorance and no background, no expertise. We probably I don't know if I had to throw it up. We probably started the company with, I brought on investors to start, maybe $20,000. And then I speak to, excuse me, some friends of mine who, once they see you're actually down the path, they're like, really, how much does it cost to start? they're assuming it's like $20 trillion. And then I speak to another like VC guy who wanted to start a drink, who approached a monster co-packer who does co-packing in the Northeast for Vitamin Water and private label 7-Eleven, like the biggest guy in town. He said, and he told him, don't start unless you have $5 to $10 million. What's your opinion on that? The numbers, what it cost, et cetera, et
Yeah, I
cetera.
mean, I wish I could give you a definitive range. I mean, I can definitely probably give you a floor that I wouldn't go below and try to start anything in any category. But that wouldn't necessarily be the bare minimum for all categories. So the variables you have to consider are the minimum order quantity from a co-man for your initial run, and that varies massively by category and packaging type. Just massively, like by an order of 10x it varies. So in some categories, a co-man's they'll do you can find someone do 10,000 units. In other categories, if you don't order 250,000 units, they won't take the meeting.
What would
So
be
that's part of the problem. So when you go into liquor and canned beverages, you get towards that 250,000 because everyone's really busy, right? And so now you're talking 500,000 or more. You probably want to be able to raise or at least be sitting on it, because you literally can't even start entering the category until you've purchased the inventory. So there are other categories where you can absolutely start with $50,000, right? And those are going to be in the categories where small runs are possible. But I would say if I were a founder in the low net margin world of consumer packaged goods, I would want to have $300,000 to $400,000 to start, because I need to be able to cover my operating costs for the first 6 to 9 months after I ship my first case, because you don't get paid right away. You've actually got to be float operations, and you have to have people. Now you can be really lean in a lot of categories with a lot of innovations. You can be super, super, super lean, but you still have some basic bills you have to pay. And it often, I think there's a huge miscalculation that first 6 months, because people thought they're going to get paid in 30 days, so they didn't actually do cash flow forecasting in Excel. So they had enough money to get the inventory, but not enough to keep going. That makes sense.
right? And like living, they have to pay them.
Yeah, I mean, and you can't use all your seed money just to get the inventory, because you actually do need some kind of minimal expense on other things. I mean, it's not a lot, but you got to do something. And I've worked with a few startups where, that little something I'm talking about is probably adding up to $5,000 to $10,000 a month, which for a phase 1 company is a lot of money. And that can mean the difference between financial problems and debt. So that's what I would say. But if you're in certain categories, Moshe, it actually needs to be more, because that minimum order is just a huge risk. And I mean, I would end my comment here by just saying, there's a way you have to approach that seed money psychologically. And this is one thing I think that has, I think makes people starting to culturally wake up to this reality, because the era of easy money, I believe, is gone forever. I don't believe the Fed that we're going to have low interest rates anytime ever again. Not like we did. I think that was a blip of poorly regulated banking sector and irresponsible politicians myself. But that's I shouldn't say it, but that's my I don't think it's ever going to happen ever again. And so because debt is now normalized, I don't know that the credit card home equity loan founders that we saw appear by the tens of thousands in the 2010s will come into play anymore, because they're going to realize one thing, which is my final point here. Oh shit, I have to be willing to throw that money down the toilet right now. And most people who started startups in 2010s, Moshe, they did not approach the business with that psychology. I have people occasionally ask me, you wrote the damn book, why don't you do it? Because I don't pass the test. I don't have the money that I'm willing to flush the toilet. It's right back. It's right in front of the back of this monitor that put right down the toilet right now. Because if you're not approaching your seed money that way, then you're setting yourself up for a real problem. And you're probably not wealthy enough to be doing this. Or risky enough. Or
So
both.
seed money is
So, you got to be willing to lose it now. Because you know how a venture capitalist thinks? That's exactly how they think. When they're writing you the check, they're basically saying it's gone. I lost it. Nothing will ever happen. And the angel investor also has the same psychology, because that's how ultra high net worth people think about small high risk investments. Is they're not going to do it unless they believe there's a potential, but they also believe that, I can lose this money too. Like I can lose it right now. In other words, I could just give him a gun and he could steal it from me and I'll be fine.
So you don't
and
recommend
that's the problem. If you think about it like a bond investment, which is rational, you're thinking about it wrong with your seed money. It has to be disposable.
So don't raise seed money from people's if they're their last penny money. You're suggesting.
Well, I don't want to tell people how to raise money through their networks, but all I can say is I've worked. I don't work with I don't really work with startups in a deep capacity anymore. I do occasional stuff to help underrepresented groups. That's about it. But raising seed money, if you happen to have a strong family, and you're probably from a community that has strong family values. I'm not from one. I'm Anglo-Saxon. We hate family. We would turn them in to the police and for anything. So we're worthless. But there's a lot of people with strong family values. They tend to be more effective seed money raisers because they have stronger ties of basic intrinsic trust. You have to figure out whether you want to expose those family relationships to disappointment. But I've worked with folks who are from those communities or from a community like that. And even them, I had a guy in Seattle. I was like, yeah, my cousin wrote me a check for $200,000. And he sat when we were having drinks before he wrote the check, he's like, I'll give you a 50-50 chance, but it's okay. Like he was willing to lose the $250,000. He sat there at the table and he was ready to dump it down the toilet. That is how you need to start your company. Moving forward, I'm really, really, really trying to frighten people out of this industry. Because I see there's so many companies failing right now because they didn't start that way. There are people becoming clinically depressed because they didn't start that way. This is what causes a mental health problem for people, is when they walk over a bridge they didn't think about properly. And we live in a culture, Moshe, and you know that too, a broader society, which is just it's egging you on, man. Everybody's like, do it. It's like a giant entrepreneurial frat party. And you can tell that I don't have a lot of respect for that. I think that you should start because you have a passion to disrupt a category and you can't sleep because of that, and because you can throw the seed money away. I mean, when I started my business, I took a small home equity loan, and that was the criteria was that money we can afford to lose, that tiny amount. And if it doesn't work, I get a day job and I have to, suck on my thumb of pride. It's just now that's really motivating for some people too, but you had to be willing to throw it away, right? And I've met people over the years who just don't seem to understand what they walked into, which it really saddened me when I first encountered that. And because it can mess with people, and it can, and it can mess with a marriage too. Just saying. It's not a joke.
My wife didn't hear that. So
your marriage is not worth, ramping your brand. I'm sorry. There's no way that I would tell people.
I like your what'd you say? Entrepreneurial frat party going on. I love that.
It's got to come to an end, people. I mean, come on.
What do you? I mean, you've been doing this for a while. if I may say, it seems to me now today that retailers are more open to new little local startup guys running. And let me just, you're saying you started with all the negatives. If you don't mind, if I could talk a little.
Hey, you're the one who started.
But that's something I expect of you. That's what we love you. Would you say, I mean, today with Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, and every bodega now in New York City suddenly says organic on it. There's this super friendly, adventurous, day one friendliness to startup CPG people versus 30 years ago, where it seems all the entrepreneurial happened in a health food store. And the fact that brands are being disrupted by online so-called influencers pushing and promoting their own brands that are not going through the strategic, typical big monster distributors, buyers, but whatever. That whole world is being disrupted in all industries. Some of the typical example right today, it's steering me in the headlights, is the Prime drink, where it's all driven by, it's like a bottom up. It's not a top down. Okay, put this on your shelf because you carry all 1,000 products. You have to carry this and try it. Versus a bottom up social media, which is basically free marketing approach, which didn't happen in the past. So two things. Number one, how do you feel about retailers being more open-minded today more than ever? And what are your feeling about influencer-driven brands?
We'll start with the retailer.
And I say day one because obviously, if there's no velocity, you're out the door anyway. So
right. Well, actually, that's the funny thing, is that there's more. I think what's happened is that there's a couple layers of fairly unsophisticated independent retailer, including independent supermarkets, independent C-stores, the corner store in the city, which are now, to your point, actually interested in they'd actually listen to you if you came in with a case of your thing and said, can I sell you this case and put it in your store? As opposed to 20, 30 years ago, they would have just stared at you and said, get out before I call the cops, which is what happened to Daniel Levetsky, right? I mean, he chased a guy around. Did you read his book? He chased a guy.
Yeah, I did.
He harassed, I mean, I don't know how he didn't get arrested, but he's an aggressive sort of Israeli dude. So he's
and he's charming.
Yeah, no, he's very he's got the Steve Jobs charisma, right? So he just pressed the guy until he said yeah, because he had to get something happening. There's more openness to that, I think, now, in part because the old generation of old cranky people who used to run those stores, they're dead. I mean, let's be honest, let's be historical. Their kids are now running those stores, and they're much more hip than Papa and Grandpapa or whoever started the store. So that has helped a lot create these beachheads for phase one brands that just need to get, like, hey, I just need 10,000 a month in revenue. That's all I need. Just gotta get going here. I really don't care where it's going from. And I talk in my book about get to 250,000 somehow in your local market, even if it seems totally nuts, because you just got to have to get your pipe, you have to get water going through the pipe. It's like, before you can start being strategic, because otherwise you don't even know if your ops work, right? You don't even know the machine works. So I do think there's more openness. We know there's more openness in the big chains, but I would say there's a couple things that have changed in the last 10 years, is that the big chains are much smarter about not pushing the startup to go national fast. So if I had done this interview 10 years ago, I would have been reiterating my warnings about, hey, just because the Kroger buyer gets excited, you need to dial them back and say, I just want to do it in Northwest. I just want to do it in West Coast. I just, whatever. Because for a long time, Moshe, Costco was the only national chain that was smart enough to realize you don't just shove stuff nationally. And that's because that's how they run their entire business for everyone. You start with a test, and then you go national. That's how they've always done things. You know, I mean, I think the only brands that got around that were probably the legacy food brands, you know, because Frito-Lay didn't have to prove its national demand to Costco. But I think the average new brand coming to Costco in any category always started with a division test and lo and behold, that turned out to be really smart for the retailer too, because it can clog up their system with nonsense that has no legs. So it's getting a lot easier to go to Kroger, get a meeting, and not have to have this anxiety that, oh my God, are they going to ask me to go in 2,800 stores? I didn't run those numbers. So it's just, you can go in and they're almost never on that page, right? They're usually coming in going, yeah, I know you're small, so we'll start you in your local division, see how you do. That's 300 stores. Here's your floor rate. Here's your minimum velocity hurdle. Blah, 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 blah. So I think that's nice. You know, that's actually really good for the newer, well-seated entrepreneur, Moshe, because the system isn't goading people into stupidity, which I describe mathematically in my book. I hope maybe some of them have read it and stopped being so crazy. Maybe they do read, the buyers have read it. So it's just like, those are the people who've disconnected from me. But I think that's not true. But I think the ecosystem got a lot smarter. It just took a lot of time for some reason. And I think that bodes well for the next generation. But the next generation has got to be better seated, not banking on 1% interest rate debt and stupid shit that honestly, if you look at the long durée of banking sector, I mean, it was obviously a blip. It's just, and I certainly wouldn't start thinking that the interest rates are all going to come down to 0.25 again. Please don't do that. Just assume they're never going to change, because that might actually be true.
So, if you're not, so what's the minimum margin today with the current interest rates? Is there like a mathematical equation?
Minimal margin, what do you mean on the business?
Same. You use what's the rate now? 6-7%?
On your average, yeah, on a good loan, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not you're not going to get that on a break-even business, Moshe. You know that.
Right.
You're going to get 15 to 20%.
Right. So used to be you promise someone a 10% return and interest rates at zero. So it sounded interesting. When your guaranteed bonds are at 6-7.
Right. Well, that's how you got the angels. One of the big ifs that I don't understand, Moshe, is where's the angel community going to net out in CPG? Because I think one of my big concerns is that they may start pulling out of this sector. The smarter ones. I could be wrong, because as the money comes back in later this year, and it will, people are going to be a little more cautious about their return thresholds. So it may be harder to get the crazy cousin to give you that check. If interest rates stay forever where they are, because it's smarter for them to put the $250,000 into a T-bill.
So we spoke technical a lot. That's why I want to go to the next question. What's your opinion about influencer-driven brands?
Yeah,
and how is that like? Or did we always have celebrities endorsing products the same thing? Or now there's so many micro minis, and people feel more connected in a certain way, cultish following more than before. And I'm just throwing it. I enjoy the disruption of it. That's why I want to talk to you about it. Because you're very, very structured approach.
We have a couple case studies of what I would call celebrity founded brands. The Honest brand is the first, which is almost a $500 million personal care business, founded by an action sex star. There's no other talent that I know. I'm sorry. She wasn't a seasoned business person, so I think she brought in partners to help her with that. So it very much was her image that drove the trial. And the other one that I'm blanking on is it's recent. Oh, Mr. Johnson, Dwayne Johnson's tequila business, but what's more interesting is his north of $100 million energy brand. So he's gotten it over the scale hump pretty quickly. But it's too early to know if it's going to last. Right. So the one thing I learned about, these big celebrity brands that have appeared mostly in liquor, they tend to scale really fast because these guys have the money to buy the distribution. The distributors are really into it. P. Diddy, I hate to say it, but P. Diddy sort of proved this pathway. And so everybody in the alcohol distribution world believes it. And so it becomes a self-reinforcing prophecy. Like if you're an A-lister, you can get an alcohol brand distributed pretty much everywhere in a year. I think you could bank on that. But doesn't mean that you'll be around in 5 years with that business. So the problem with these businesses that use mega fame to build that trial tsunami, which is almost equivalent to Pepsi doing an ad campaign for a launch in power, I agree, is that it's aberrant and it's an unavailable model to your average entrepreneur. So to me, it's just noise. So, I mean, I would never point someone to that as a playbook or, the idea that you're going to what are you going to do? Find that agent who gets you in touch with George Clooney? That's never going to happen. Are you kidding me? So what drives the growth that's I talk about my book that's bankable is using your early fans as the influencers. And that I will hang my red hat on that till I croak. If you can't get your initial consumers so jazzed about what you're doing, it's not that interesting. It's not that memorable. It's probably not the next thing. Now, you could still push your business and push it up the hill, but you're going to have to push more if your fans aren't behind you, and that's just more expensive. And so that becomes a game for the truly rich, right? The reason I wrote the book is that the fans will increase the financial efficiency of your business. It's very easy to calculate how much more efficient it gets.
When you say buy distribution, even sliding all that, how rich do you need to be if nothing ever sells? I mean, you just keep on paying them rent and they'll keep on the shelf because they're making enough money with the rent? I mean, what's the practical?
So the people who buy distribution and scale tend not to actually make crappy products, Moshe, I'll be honest. Like they're not garbage products. Because if they have that money, they're generally from the industry, Moshe, and they have some basic connections to vet the basics and then outsource the quality control and the product design and stuff like that. So they tend not to launch the real mediocre stuff. I hate to say it, but it's the noobs who launch the real mediocre stuff that's not turning. Like it's not turning because of a couple, it's just not innovative. It's actually the 20th brand to do X. That's what an amateur that's a kind of big mistake an amateur tends to fall into. Is that they didn't do any competitive research at all. You'll still see that at Expo West. You'll see these people who they are pumped at their booth, man. If they're not pumped, but they don't realize that there's no market share left for them. That they're probably 20 years too late.
I mean, how often are you surprised? Sorry, how often are you surprised by a random breakaway?
How often am I surprised? In other words, I knew about it, but I didn't think it was going to happen.
No, when you said, "Oh, this thing's been around for 20 years," and poof, or it doesn't have. I'm just.
Yeah, there are occasional stories. I want to think that there might even be one in my.
And
book.
An example would be, it's been around for 20 years, but now the celebrity suddenly, I don't know what.
I don't know what
it became a TikTok fad, and so today.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible if it was purely a local business that's totally possible, because it doesn't exist and it has no awareness. I mean, there might be this tiny group of fans in one city or something, but when you're talking about these big name influencers growing sales, what they're doing is just advertising. I think it's important, even if it wasn't paid for it, because they're the founder, they're just doing an essential, they're functioning like an ad because they're so powerful with celebrity symbol. That's not influence. Does that make sense? That's not real human influence. Human influence is getting someone to try something when the basis of the relationship has nothing to do with that. It's some other relationship that's intense, you know. So I'm your parent, I'm your son, I'm your daughter, or whatever, and I show you something and you try it because of the trust in that very, very deep relationship. That's one angle. The other one is peer groups, right? Also can be relatively high trust. So when you're influencing on the basis of a pre-existing trust relationship, it's not only free, but it's actually more credible, because just as you said, like you said when we kicked off, you know, you didn't read my book because I told you to, or some creepy investor that you wanted their money from told you to. You know, it was just some random dude you didn't even know, right? So you're good, there's no agenda, right? So you're getting a recommendation from a weak tie, I guess, and that weak tie is more credible than the person with the agenda, right? The funny thing is that I think that's the mode of influencing that's actually much more powerful than people realize. The trick is, how do you scale that? So the allure that people have with, if I could just find an influencer with enough advertising power, is that the average founder is gonna have to pay that person. And I definitively know that you don't get the return when you pay for that, because you end up getting a lot of what they call curiosity trial from people who aren't really, they're reacting to a very strange kind of nudge from a celebrity, but it's not actually how most people make decisions in the categories that we are selling in consumer packaged goods.
Do you think the ROI on an influencer is not good?
On average, it's really bad for the paid influencer space. I mean, that's pretty well known.
Unless
it's no different than paying for advertising, like really expensive trade advertising. Except the trade ads, you can actually measure pretty directly what the effect of sales was. Not perfectly, but better than the influencer. So attribution is one of the issues. What has been more convincing, what has been more useful for influencing is, rather than driving sales volume, is using it as a marketing tool to build awareness within a specific social networks and tribes that are going to be interested in what you're doing. You know, for kind of geeky health and wellness offerings, and certain categories, that's worked really, really well. But it's not about getting Beyonce to endorse you. That's actually overkill early on. And what it may actually do is create an enormous run on inventory for people who are just fooling around on they're basically messing with you, even though they're paying you. They're messing with your inventory, and they're never going to be repeat customers, because the last thing you want is for Beyonce to convince them to try it because just she told them to. Right? Beyonce has to be able to convey some kind of symbolic argument why they should do it. Now she can try, but in a lot of categories, she's not going to be convincing. She's going to be convincing in apparel, jewelry, cosmetics. Sorry, dancing shoes. I mean, literally, that's the kind of categories where she's going to be compelling, because she knows what she's talking about.
So you're saying the influencer needs to be directly brandedly aligned with your product in order to get the best ROI.
They need to be an expert user in the category you're selling. Then they can have a lot of power. And my point is, why would you go to Beyonce for that? That's like totally overpaid. You know, you can find these people several rungs below. And so that is one of the oldest principles of field marketing, right? Is to that Cliff Bar, Cliff Bar would use the fitness, these very tiny little fitness geeks, like the world champion mountain biker who nobody in America knows about except 20,000 people, right? But in his tribe, he was the shill, right? He was the dude. So you just believe. Plus, when he tells you that you need to have this energy bar because he's used it on his, crazy ultra cycling ride in Switzerland, then you're going to believe it. So it's that combination of expertise and fame, which is much more powerful. But that expertise needs to be somehow linked to your category. And that's also why not all categories are super amenable. You know, some are just shallow culturally. So, I don't know what to say. Like, and others don't require, like, there's a lot of low sugar innovation out there. And I don't, that's one where it's like, do you really need to go pay a diet or weight management guru to hawk your thing? It's so obvious.
Well,
You know,
what-
like Spindrift has not been running around paying influencers. Spindrift has been using field marketing and sampling and distribution. But once you have it, you're either going to hate it or you're going to be in. It's just like, and they figured that out early. They didn't need to go. It's not that complicated, I guess.
a dollar that comes into a startup, a CBG, not even a regular CBG, whatever you want to call it. What percent goes back? Like, what do you say the spread is? 30% goes back into marketing, and marketing includes anything from demoing to ads to influencers to whatever you
Yeah, I
want to say.
mean, my aggregate P&L knowledge at this point is not as high as some folks in the industry, but I know enough to venture some kind of answer. Trade spend is usually about 25% of gross sales, and if you don't budget for that, again, this is part of that seed money thing. This is when people get into real trouble. In the early years, when if you're using retail primarily, you're unfortunately having to pay all these service fees and other things as part of your getting in and part of making it work, to be honest.
Such as, could you be specific?
Well, it'll be volume promos on a promo calendar, very clever. They always want you to commit to a promo plan. You know, those are monies that you're paying. Then there's through the distributors, then there's retailer ads and other things that this little package of fees, you know, it all get the chargeback hell, basically. But you need to budget for that to be upwards of 25%. It will come down as you scale, but in the beginning, it's just painful. For consumer marketing, what I tell people is that, you know, if you're in a category that's amenable to that, in other words, where people need to sample the goods to know if they should bother, like you're in one of those. And this is like not true for flour. There's a lot of categories, man. But if you're in one of those categories, then you've got to do sampling, right? And so now whatever budget is to be oriented to that. And the beauty about field marketing sampling is your primary cost is the wholesale cost, as the production cost per unit.
If you do it yourself.
And you do it yourself because that's what I'm telling you to do. That's how you keep it reasonable. But, you know, I think the reality is at least 10% to cover those kinds of costs, to cover travel, to cover hosting site fees, to show up, put your tent up and things like that. Yeah. So this becomes, you know, there's, you know,
So 35% back into the marketing stuff.
Into trade and consumer at a bare minimum. And if you don't have the seed money to front that in the first 6 to 12 months, you have not properly planned, is kind of my point.
That's me.
And I think there's not enough open discussion about having because that's what I mean. To me, a classic business person would say, James, marketing's not a fixed operating cost. So don't stop talking to them about that. But you know what? It is. It's a survival cost, right? Because if you don't get the velocity going, it doesn't matter how lean your core operations are, like your utility bill and your office rent or whatever, your swag budget, your crappy salaries you're paying your folks. You need to think of these as core expenses because they really kind of are, and they're just really high as a proportion of sales early on. They will come down. I mean, I can't show you the P&Ls, but I promise they come down. And if you don't believe me, you can go to the public companies because the highest percent of ad spend is a percent of gross revenue. Moshe, which industry do you think that is? Which mega category?
Go for it.
Big
The most
companies.
what?
It's the cereal. It's the cereal category.
Is the most trade spend?
No, most
Mar-
marketing.
Marketing.
So once a business becomes mature, marketing and trade go way down as a proportion of spend. But and that's when you're really humming because you have a mature consumer base and yada yada yada. But like advertising as a percent of sales peaks in CPG around 8 to 10% for the very ad heavy industry, ad heavy category. But it's usually around 4 to 5. And I'm talking like 20, 30, $40 million ad budgets per brand. So for the top brands. So it's not like they're spending a ton of money. It's just that as a percent of these multi-billion-dollar entities, it just vanishes, right? This is why when you get really big, you get profitable. So that's your end point. I mean, most of you may not get there, but that's your proof that as you scale, all these annoying ancillary expenses come down as a proportion of revenue, but they're very high in the beginning.
And your terms get better also.
They get better and better. Yeah.
From 90 days to you have more leverage because they actually want your brand.
You have more leverage to negotiate some things, but you can create that leverage. Not immediately, but you can create it once you get going and have when you have a velocity track record, you can start to create some leverage because you're comparing yourself against the peer who's flailing and fumbling, right? And you always want to be trying to seem more mature than you are in front of the buyer with data. And you'd be surprised what kind of leverage that can get you. Plus the old charm package, which is still a superpower. You talked about personality, and I think, I know I threw away the introvert extrovert thing, but I think that, if you're in a very competitive category, I think certain amount of interpersonal charisma is an asset to have. I just can't prove that it's absolutely necessary. I can't.
Right. So you said before,
I've seen some really shy introverted people do fine.
They're a lot more focused.
Yeah.
So you currently today, Doc, you consult mostly with what, 50 million plus sales brand? Where do you play?
No, I'm not that elitist yet. I started about 5 million in company sales.
5 million plus.
Yeah, I bend the rules sometimes, but usually the reason I set that as a filter is just because usually that's when the operations are smooth, people know how they're producing, the supply chain smoothed out, so that the founding leadership can actually focus on the growth levers and absorb what I'm probably going to tell them to do. Versus in the beginning, it's kind of a scramble. And I'm not particularly cheap, so I know the damage to a P&L is more severe with my fees. So I don't want to do that.
FMA, you charge is it like a 6-month, 12-month contract type of thing?
No, I mainly do 6 to 8 weeks sort of. I basically sell strategic planning sessions. So it's like a 4
so in and out. And
then I do retainers with those clients if they want me around to keep them kind of disciplined, organized. And those are usually going to be more the amateurs or foreign companies, to be honest, because they're just still getting used to the US market. Yeah. So it is more of I'm like a rentable brand manager. And it's not the kind of person you want in your team. You don't want me on your team. You want me helping the team, and then please build a home.
So you want to do your surgery and leave.
It takes all kinds, Moshe, and some of us should be by ourselves.
You need the optimistic, in the day-to-day grind to keep it going, but then you need the realist to, cut off all the fat and tell you really what's going on.
And I think that's sadly a role I enjoy playing. But it's also where I'm good because I just don't get caught up in people's reactions to the bad news.
All right.
For people who are new to consulting, that's actually one of the biggest learning curves, is becoming emotionally detached like a surgeon. You really have to be able to do that. If you get caught up in the client's wincing, suddenly you're gonna start just telling them what they want to hear, and then you might as well not even be there. It's just like, I mean, to me, that's like theft. If I take your money and just tell you what you want to hear.
Very interesting. Do you, and your prices, I'm saying this for the audience, your prices, I guess they call you to get pricing, right? Or is it off
Oh,
the
no,
rack
no,
price?
I'm very transparent. In
Oh,
21st century.
so what's your pricing? If the
I start
newer,
at for the smaller brands, I start at 20K. And then the bigger ones, it's about 30 and up.
so 20K, 6 to 8 weeks, you show up in person or online?
I prefer to go virtually, but it depends. It depends on what the client is. I'm not afraid to meet.
Did you start your consulting before the book or after the book or because of the book?
Oh no, I started it before, but yeah, it has evolved.
The book pushed you a lot farther.
Yes, it increased my fees.
Are there, I'm just curious, are there any other super niche CPG branded books like yours, or it seems pretty niche? No one ever said this book or that book. If you don't,
Well, I think the problem is that there's a ton of marketing books, but those are mostly by academics, or they're by Seth Godin, and Seth Godin's not going to do consulting with you. So, because he started rich off a Yahoo stock, and he just could, he'd rather just make speaking fees. So most of the people who've written the better books, and he's one of them, on marketing, they're not going to come work with you in an applied fashion. And then the folks that do work with startups tend to be more on the sales ops side. So that was the hole I was trying to fill, because it's so much more competitive now. That the idea that you can get to 50 million and then wake up and say, yeah, we need a positioning. We need a strategy now. I mean, those days are gone.
Some brands will just stick at 2 million a year, 3 million, 4 million, and that's what they are. They have their, you cover the niche, and that's it.
And I think those are the folks, and that's totally fine. Especially if you're in the artisan world, I think that's totally cool. I have total respect for that, because usually, most 90% of the artisan local product that's put out at a farmer's market and stuff, it can't really follow the principles of my book, because they're not willing to actually change their formulation to get that SRP down, to unlock the scale, and because to doing it would make it less high quality, and that's fine. I get it. It is, but you'd be surprised, man. You can scale artisan goods. It just takes a lot more time and effort to reach your elite customer, because they're spread thinly all over the country, right? I mean, I'm talking about people who would pay for, I don't know, $129 chocolate trays and stuff. There's a company out of Seattle. They have a digitally marketed, it used to be catalog, Franz Chocolate. They're a sizable business. I don't think they're more than 50 million, but it's a great family business, man.
To the question, what margin what margin does artisanal brand run on versus a high volume mainstream brand? Like, what's considered acceptable?
Yeah,
or
I think
manageable?
I think when you've covered your fixed operating costs, right? Now you can choose your growth rate. Until then, you're basically just hemorrhaging. You're bleeding out of your arteries. But once you cover your fixed operating costs, you can decide, do I want to grow 20% a year or 200% because I read this crazy guy's book. And that's a choice you have to really think about, because it changes your whole universe and almost every executional decision. The margin required to grow fast without becoming dependent on private equity and just giving the company to somebody is going to be in the 50 to 70% range without raising tons of money. That's going to make you much more autonomous, much faster. You'll still have to raise money, but not nearly as much. When you start to get down into 30%, 35%, you become dependent on capital, or as an amateur entrepreneur, you tend to go under really fast.
Under 35.
Yeah, and on the first couple of years. So if you're a bigger brand, like say you're a $5 million artisan chocolate brand, and somehow you climbed your way on 20% margins, you can make that work, but it has to be very slow growth rate. So if you look at a brand like Theo Chocolate in Seattle, which is now a sizable national chocolate player on the shelves almost everywhere, that's a 25-year, 30-year growth story. And it was not fast at all, because they couldn't make it fast with their quality standards, their sourcing standards. And they didn't have the capital just turn on a whole bunch of retailers. It doesn't work that way when you have really high standards. But see, their costs eventually, even though it was a longer journey, eventually their costs of production and supply did come down. That allows them to bring out, their $4 rectangle chocolate bar, which is really what scaled them. But originally, Theo was this tiny little boutique bar that cost I can't even remember. It was just ridiculously expensive in the 90s.
Last question. I don't want to go over too much time. What's the likelihood for someone to start a brand, put it on the shelf, and it just sells itself by the founder doing nothing, and it's not flour, just a nice packaging, and it just.
My guess is it's a beverage. That's my guess, or it's a
saying a beverage could do that.
Beverage or some other impulse snack. And so in other words, the category is giving it a tailwind. The package symbolism is doing something. You're just really lucky. This is the story of Skinny Pop. It's in an impulse category. It was low calorie in an ocean of crappy caramel corn and God knows what. So it was just like, it really stuck out to even a sloppy, harried, busy shopper, right? At Whole Foods or anywhere else. So how often does that happen? Very rarely.
The problem with that, these one-off stories bring out people because the media overly covers it, like, oh, and then people think that's expectations, and they get depressed when they're not the next Skinny Pop or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many timing and luck variables that go into some of those crazy stories. I mean, I only wrote about Skinny Pop because the package symbolism, ex post facto, we can verify behaviorally as to why that actually did work. And that's not because you should just, the lesson in my book was not read my book and then pray that you have the same luck. I mean, the point was that you probably don't have this going on. I think I say that in the book. This is not happening for you. They got lucky. Make sure that as you iterate and refine your business, that you get your symbolism to be this effective. And here's why it worked, because none of it was planned.
What's considered impulse? What's considered impulse? Beverage, snack?
It's a specific set of categories, and you're in it. Soft drinks, candy.
I'm sorry for my amateur questions. I apologize.
Yeah, candy, and salty snacks, munchies, junk food.
So anything right in front of the cashier.
Pretty much, yeah.
Anything that 10 feet.
Yeah. Anything selling salt, sugar, butter, fat, crunch, and munch. This is America, man. I mean, you can make it premium, you can make it $20 a box, you can make it $1.50 a box. So, welcome to America. But the reality is that's the stuff that people will impulsively buy. They don't impulsively buy a pound of flour. They don't impulsively buy canned tomatoes. I'm just being asinine, but the point is just like, so yeah, if you're in one of those categories, good luck. The nice thing is you have impulsivity on your side. The bad news is that you have so many competitors, you should cry. So it's like, that's where you have to get really kind of devious and guerrilla about how you enter and try not to do what everyone else is doing.
What percent of these premium brands end up going mainstream to middle of America, Iowa, or is it like 2%? I mean, because it seems the more I don't know, middle class, lower class, I don't know what the right word is. Most of these premium brands never end up falling through the cracks and landing into these stores. No? And will they ever, or just not their culture? Or is it too expensive?
I think part of it can be the every one of these premium products is making an implicit symbolic argument of some kind, and it could be even a sensory argument, right? And that's just not always relevant to a large chunk of America. It's a very complicated country. We're actually very stratified, segregated, and there's a lot of problematic divisions. Needless to say, and those aren't just in cities; they're everywhere. And so, what seems super relevant in Brooklyn at some hip cafe, I mean, is probably the subject of abject mockery at a bar in Iowa. So, if you can't handle that, don't get in this game. So, it's like, I think the reality is it's less than 1% are going to get into that $100 million mid-market, lower mid-market tier. That's a combination of having what I talk about in the book as a very mainstream outcome being the basis of the brand. And so they're not like aloe vera juice trying to reduce your, I don't know, inflammatory response or something weird.
Like kombucha, do you think kombucha is like it hit its peak, or you think you'll?
Oh no, I know it has because I've seen the data. So that's why I, for free, I can tell you if you're a regional kombucha brand, don't go national and think that you're gonna be the fourth guy who's 250 million, because it's very unlikely to happen. Stay in your niche. It's a lot like craft beer. It's like there aren't many ways for craft beer to be the next national mega brand. I mean, the reality is it's a world of $5 and $10 million local businesses that turn over, and if you like brewing, it's a great lifestyle. You can pay for a nice mortgage and life can be good. But getting mainstream is really, you have to be able to take significant market share from the Frito-Lays in your category. And that's a process. And I work with clients on this, on actually mainstreaming your positioning as you grow. So.
And your final thoughts on Expo West? Were you there?
I don't go to the trade shows. No.
Oh, you don't go?
I'm too introverted to handle the noise.
I assume you run around all the time.
No, I used to, but that was because I had to build a business. Like I talk about, but I had to build my reputation from the street up. So, so I don't have much to say on Expo West.
Gotcha.
I know a lot of people who thought this was a good one.
Whatever that means.
Not as crowded. Not as crowded is good or bad? That's good, because these shows before the pandemic, it was getting out of control, to be honest. It had become a ticket selling machine. It was kind of like Disney World. When they start at 700, you make a lot of money by adding 10,000 people. And I think it's kind of reset to a more normal.
Saying it became more B2C than B2B.
Yeah, it was much more B2C, but more than that, it was just tons of agencies and, consultants, and, not going there to me is almost, I'm trying to do a service. You don't
Okay.
pay 30 grand for a booth to meet me. I mean, that's not what you get.
Some will argue.
I hope not.
Well, they'll pay for it, so apparently they're paying the 20 G's,
Yeah,
doctor.
that's a lot more value than a 5-minute booth chat.
You'd be surprised. A one-liner with your sharp mind. You get your 30K value. Now, most
All right.
people not. They're just selling you another video marketing agency. You know, yeah, sign up with me, spend 2 million with me. I never met you. I just walked over to your booth. Sure,
Yeah.
here's my money.
Yeah, I don't do that.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, expertise,
You're welcome.
honesty, and rawness of that we all need to hear.
That's awesome, man. Thanks for having me, Moshe. Have a good rest of your week.
Sure. And this, stop.